Hi, I'm Ann Kornblut, and I want to thank everyone for joining this panel. And really, first, I want to thank the JCC in Palo Alto and Zach Bodner for inviting all of us to participate. Zach has been a real visionary with Z3 every year, and it's thrilling we can now extend the audience beyond the people who have attended the conference. So, thank you. Um, I want to introduce our panelists, who I don't think have ever gotten together before, certainly not with me. They're both tremendous journalists and thinkers who've had a major impact on culture and who are powerful in ways that are both different and alike. Uh, Merav Michaeli is a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, from the Labor Party, who's been a member of the Knesset since the 19th Knesset in 2013. She served on the House Committee, Foreign Affairs, Defense Committee, and her activities have extended over many, many issues and sectors. But especially, she's very famous for the socioeconomic discourse, gender equality, the relationship between state and religion, LGBTQ rights, labor rights, and promoting the peace process. Before that, she was a very senior journalist at Haaretz and published a lot of op-eds and interviews that I'm sure many people have seen. And she's also a very well-known feminist activist. Bari Weiss, until earlier this year, 2020, was a staff writer and editor for the opinion section of the New York Times. Before joining the Times, Bari was an op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal and an associate book review editor there. For 2 years, she was a senior editor at Tablet, the online magazine of Jewish news, as everyone knows, where she edited political and news coverage. And she's probably best known to this audience as a regular on The View, Morning Joe, and Bill Maher. She is a proud Pittsburgh native and a graduate of Columbia, which is also my alma mater. And she's the winner of Reason Foundation's 2018 Bastiat Prize, which annually honors writing that best demonstrates the importance of freedom and originality, wit, and eloquence. She is also the author of How to Fight Anti-Semitism, which I highly recommend. So with that, the name of this panel is Israel, the Media, and the New Media, but we're going to throw in a few more topics, including the US, which I hope is okay, because we've had a few things happen here in recent weeks. I'll also mention that I sourced questions from my friends, people at the JCC, by Facebook groups. So there's going to be a few things that aren't curveballs, but are things that came from outside just the inside of my head. So with that, let's jump right in. My whole life has been spent in the media, much like you all, but for me, specifically journalism and newspapers. I was at the New York Daily News, the New York Times, before Bari was there, the Washington Post. Everywhere I worked, the Boston Globe, everywhere, there was a complicated relationship between the news organization and Israel and the Jewish diaspora and the Jews that we covered. There was no place where I worked where it was easy or where it wasn't a source of, it wasn't a pain point. Then I left traditional journalism and I joined Facebook. And I think it's fair to say that the relationship is also fraught. So I want to ask you both, this pain point, coverage of Jewish issues, coverage of Israel, where are we with it? And is the traditional news coverage growing more fair? Is it growing more anti-Semitic? Are the legacy and social media facing different issues or similar issues? And I'd like to ask you a little bit. I mean, the example that comes to mind for me, there's always one, right? Like every few months. But around COVID and the official accusations of ultra-Orthodox, not abiding by the rules, there's both the official conversation around that. There's also the coverage of it, which then becomes a conversation about coverage of Jews and anti-Semitism. So with my very long preamble, sorry for that, Bari, let me ask you to start. What do you think?
Okay, amazing question. There's 20 questions in it. I guess I'll start with the last one, which is about COVID and the fact that, the legacy media, I would say, and a lot of our sort of pointy head punditry enlightened classes really showed their ass, if I can say that on a JCC call, in that it was clear that, if you had a certain political view, that you somehow could participate in mass gatherings and not get or spread COVID. But if you were participating in another kind of gathering, that somehow you were, guilty of science denial and spreading the disease. So I really think that the way that COVID was covered and the intense focus on, let's say, religious gatherings as being incredibly dangerous and Black Lives Matter rallies as being something to be lauded, including by thousands of doctors, was a radicalizing event for a lot of people. That's separate, I think, though, from the broader question you were asking about Israel, which I think to some extent reflected the old conventional wisdom, the conventional wisdom held by people in think tanks, people in DC, John Kerry, up until a few years ago. There's a famous video of him going around in which he really, really concisely expresses this viewpoint. And the viewpoint is that it's linkage, right? It was the idea that if you want to solve the broader problems of the Middle East and all of the sort of pathologies that set groups against one another, well, the only way to do that is to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And until you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, chaos is going to reign, and and that was kind of the idea. Well, it came from an unlikely source, but I think that the past year has proven the absolute folly of that view. It was just, it might have been, conventional wisdom, but there was nothing wise about it. It was just what a lot of people tended to think. And so I think that in part, the fixation of the New York Times and other places on Israel and on the conflict with the Palestinians had to do with just a mirroring or an echoing of that conventional viewpoint, of which they were also sort of marinating in that view. The last thing I'll say is that, and we can get deeper into this, but I'm really interested in what Merav has to say. Anne, you used to work at a tabloid. I love the Daily News, love the New York Post even more, but love the Daily News. And the old idea, right, is if it bleeds, it leads. And it's also true that if you could also have the slogan that, like, if Jews are involved, if Jerusalem is involved, it's just a story. People are inordinately focused on Jews and on Israel. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that that speak, well, I'll leave it at that. But I really think that the question is well put, because there is an incredible fixation on it. And that's something that I saw every single day when I worked at the Times.
Merav, I'd love to hear what you think. I had framed the question in a very US-centric way, so I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, I have to admit that the way you put the question was intriguing for me, because it sort of unveiled for me a whole reality of people living in the US having to deal with covering Israel and Jewish life and considering it pain. Oh my God, I was completely unaware of the pain that you described, and it's sad for me to hear that, and it's, as I said, intriguing. And at the same time, I listened to Bari describing the way that the same sort of crowding, the anti-COVID, despite COVID crowding being portrayed differently about different communities. And this is mirroring exactly the same phenomenon in Israel, because in Israel it's the same. We got into this fight. Can you protest but you can't pray, or the other way around? Is it okay to open the synagogues but not okay to protest? And we were of course attacking the government on that, because in Israel I think the difference was that in the beginning of COVID, the general population was extremely obedient and very careful, and people stayed home and did not go out, while the ultra-Orthodox community did not. So even though afterwards it already varied and people did continued to protest, and people started going to weddings. And of course, the Arab society had their huge weddings where people got COVID like crazy. So it became a mess. But in the beginning, it was exactly the same sort of dichotomy that Barry was describing. So I felt like as if it's once removed. Um, you know, when I had the privilege of holding the last interview with Tony Judd, the late Tony Judd, and it was published in The Atlantic. And when he died, when he passed away, I wrote an open in Haaretz describing how the dynamic that was happening in Israel with the polarization between right and left over the conflict and over Jewish identity just happened in America the same way, but a few years later. So I think that the process was such that by now we are already very similar in this dynamic. And first of all, the polarization in America became, I mean, really, at some point when President Trump was elected, I said to my friends and colleagues in America, welcome to our lives. And you certainly went for it all the way. But we've been living like that with Netanyahu for 12 years by now. Just try to imagine what it would have been like had you had to go through this for 12 years. So taking it back to the conflict, you know, describing it as a fixation is an option. It does play into the narrative that Netanyahu is now promoting, Netanyahu and Trump, of course. But at the end of the day, we can have, first of all, I will claim that we had the opportunity of this kind of peace agreements already in 2002, when the when the Arab League Peace Initiative was presented to Israel, and it offered normalization with all of the Arab countries in exchange for a Palestinian state in the 67 borders and an agreed upon solution for for Jerusalem and the refugees. And no Israeli prime minister has ever responded to that initiative. So now we are kind of taking it from the other end of it. But at the end of the day, Israel has to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because this is the most dramatic danger to its future. Not even Iran, as dangerous as it might be, not only for Israel, but the region in general, and to world peace, but the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something that if Israel wants to remain or to renew its days as the democratic state of the Jewish people, it will have to figure out. There is no way around it.
Well, I'm gonna come back to that. I want to. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I strongly agree with that last statement. And yet, Merav, would you agree that when you look at the Middle East, you know, as a whole, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is nowhere near that even the top 10 of the most pressing issues preventing, you know, something like peace in the region? That's what what I'm contending is that the fish on it in the American press bears very little relationship to how important it is to the Middle East story. Meaning, if every newspaper has a dwindling amount of resources and, you know, foreign bureaus and foreign correspondents, and Jerusalem always seems to be sort of like the center point of people's attention. Maybe you think that's justified. I'm just curious.
Well, it's certainly not exclusive. It's certainly not. It's not a linchpin that, you know, once solved, in given that it can be okay, means that everything else will, you know, fall in place. But it is a linchpin, even in the sense that it provides an excuse to so many other hostile factors in the region. Even in that sense, it will generate major change once there is genuine advancement or something really happens in the direction of a peace process regarding the conflict. So I completely agree. I mean, like the war in Libya, for instance, okay? Obviously, it does not have anything to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the whole sort of how countries and forces are divided in the Middle East, all of them have something to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And once this is changed, it will change a lot in the area. But having said all this, as an Israeli, all this is a lot less important for me. And what's the most important thing for me is to care about Israel's security and sustainability. And for that, I need to find a way to figure out this conflict.
Yeah. Merav, I want
And
to.
I had one more thing to maybe
yeah,
share that might be
yeah.
interesting to people. We're living in an era, at least in the States, or at least let's say in like, the liberal institutions, like places like the New York Times, in which there is an unbelievably intense fixation on diversity, inclusion, making sure work is a safe space for everyone. And yet, the lack of care when it comes to Jews inside these institutions is striking. For example, the New York Times ran two, large puff pieces about the writer Alice Walker while I was there, who is a medieval anti-Semite. She writes poems about the blood-sucking rabbis of the Talmud. She talks about the lizard Illuminati. She's a huge fan of David Icke, who was banned from YouTube. We ran puff pieces about her. The Times ran one recently about Louis Farrakhan, basically saying he was just a gentleman who was sort of misunderstood. There was no editor's notes appended to those things when there was criticism from the outside and criticism from Jewish employees. Nothing happened at all. In the meantime, and this is, an example that kind of blew my mind, there was a profile that ran in the news side of the new Iraqi prime minister. I think this was about a year ago. And he was described by the writer as a Western-style leader. There was an uproar in the diversity Slack of the New York Times saying that describing him as a Western-style leader was bigoted because it was Orientalist. The language inside the piece was changed. The international editor apologized, as did the writer of the piece. So think about the fact that all of that attention for a single adjective, and yet whole pieces run that whitewash full-on anti-Semites, and there's not a peep. And so, to put it bluntly, there's a kind of principle at work of diversity. Yes, bullying is bad, except when it comes to the Jews. There's a kind of Jews don't count principle that is sort of hard to overstate.
That's wow. I am unaware of that, I have to admit, because I don't follow the American. I mean, I follow American media to some extent, but not that closely. So I'm really unaware of that reality that you are now portraying, and it's painful to hear. You should explain to me, you guys, the two of you can maybe explain to me why and how this happens. I can relate to it from our point of view, Israel's point of view, when we often feel that Israel is being bashed horribly for its human rights policies, or not, keeping human rights well enough, whereas other countries who are much worse are being treated as if they're like, it's no big deal. Nobody's even counting what it is that they're doing when they're not doing. So I guess there's something similar about that, but it's fascinating to me. And if you can explain to me how what you just described is happening, happy to understand. I mean, how worrying is that to you?
I'm really curious what Anne would say about why that's happening. I
So I
can
think
explain.
I think my perspective would be the conversation that tends to happen is that Jews in the United States, although I wonder if there's something parallel to what happens in Israel, is that Jews are effectively white. And because the conversation in the United States is very much around race, and in many cases, people of color, skin color, that Jews are part of a white privileged majority that is not in the same situation of oppression. Barry, does that sound like? That is the conversation that I generally see. Now, whether that is the genuine conversation that's happening, or whether that is a code for or an excuse for anti-Semitism, is another piece of the conversation. And like all things, it depends on the specifics of which situation you're talking about. But I feel like that's probably the framework that it happens in. Is that what you think as well, Barry?
Yeah, totally. It's that Jews are sort of twice cursed in this prevailing new illiberal ideology that goes by various names: critical race theory, wokeness. Some have called it the sort of, Majid Nawaz calls it, the totalitarian left. But what it basically posits is that Jews are basically a fake minority because they've been invited into whiteness, including, by the way, Mizrahi Jews. I was meeting the other day with a woman who was, father's from Turkey, mom's from Morocco, and she's like, I'm not white, but I'm treated as if I am white because I've been invited into whiteness in this sort of black and white, hyper racialized view of looking at the world. And then because 95% of Jews identify as Zionists, maybe it's 90%, that's our second sin, because not only are we sort of handmaidens of white supremacy, because we are a sort of fake minority, but we are also loyal to the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East. And so we're guilty of the sort of the worst of the modern sins. We're guilty of participating in systemic racism, and we're guilty of upholding white settler colonialism. And all of that is sort of combining to erase, in a way, any oppression. It's like Jews can't be victims, and unless it's such a horrific incident like what happened in my hometown of Pittsburgh, that's one thing. But the kind of rolling attacks that have happened on the streets of Brooklyn for the past 2 years, in which Jews have had their wigs ripped off, had their face smashed in with a paving stone, had their child's bus pelted with rocks, had their synagogues assaulted, and on and on and on. That's a story that doesn't rate in the same way because those Jews are imperfect victims, because they're Haredim, because they're all these kinds of things. And the people that are attacking them are, considered to be in the victim category themselves because they themselves are not white supremacists. So when everything is filtered through this kind of ideology, you're either on the side of the oppressed or the oppressor, the victim or the victimizer. And the Jews are not falling on the right side of the divide, if that makes sense.
Wow. That's harsh. That's not easy at all. But I'll tell you that my association, when you were describing these terrible things that from Brooklyn, my association was about anti-Semitism incidents, anti-Semitic incidents that took place in Europe, in all kinds of places, where my criticism towards my government in Israel was that it did not take a strong stand against this kind of anti-Semitism because the governments in these, let's say, places such as Hungary,
Yes.
they support the Israeli government
Israel.
on its the Israeli government, yes, on its right wing policies in the West Bank. So it's a trade-off which I thought was very dangerous. And I thought that the fact that somehow the Israeli government was very lenient towards these governments, sort of choosing their support in this domestic policies over fighting or taking a stronger stand against anti-Semitism was, for me, something that was very alarming. And, I was very loud about this. So again, I feel like a double catch-22 here.
Yes. And in a way, I mean, Trump is not Viktor Orban and it's a different situation, but it's a little bit similar in that, a lot of leaders who I'd say are stoking bigotry at home, like, Trump dismantled the moral guardrails that keep bigotry down. He created an environment where I think the reality for most minorities is less safe now than it was before he was president. And yet he is an outspoken, lots of Jews liked his Israel policy and they sort of felt betwixt and between and very, very torn about which side they were on, so to speak. So
well, that's a question I actually want to ask you both.
One question. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, but that's a question I'm going to get to, but I want to make sure I don't miss out. Well, I'm going to ask it now. You've both talked about political homelessness for Jews and for Israelis, not knowing which party to go with in this polarization that we're talking about. And I'm wondering, first of all, is there a path out of that political homelessness? And does something new happen with the incoming Biden administration, at least in the US, to help address that? Or is this just an ongoing, I mean, we see it across the generations, young Jews who go to college in the US and they don't feel comfortable on liberal campuses, even though they might have many liberal beliefs that they hold because of the BDS movements on campuses. And so I'm wondering, and Merav, maybe you've talked about I think you said it was 1.5 million, Israelis who don't have a place to go because of the situation. Wondering if how does it feel now? Do you see a path out, or is it just, frankly, getting worse?
Well, so first of all, we are looking up to you because you've managed to, at least for now, win over Trumpism. Even if not, I mean, many people still voted for Trump and Republicans, but still, you are going to have a whole new and different president and vice president, and a whole different administration with a very, very different tone. And it's like for us, it's a beacon of hope, looking at what's happened in the US and thinking that, yes, it's possible. Problem is that not only our political structure is, the system is different, but the thing is that our liberal camp has been crumbling down for many years now. And so the situation is really dire right now. It's really crushed. And there is no functioning political platform on which we can start building. I am now waging a fight over rescuing whatever's left of labor, because I believe that this is the platform on which we need to start rebuilding this political camp. And the tragedy, if I may use this strong word, is that, as you've mentioned, we have at least 1.5 million Israelis who desperately want to vote for someone who will represent their wish for a democratic Jewish homeland, for a place that does aspire for equality and for security through peace, and, a fair treatment to each and every citizen, etc., etc. And unfortunately, the leaders of this camp for too long have, even when they did get many, many mandates, have given in to the right and given the mandates to Netanyahu ever since 2009. In 2009, it was Ehud Barak who went with labor into the the Netanyahu government. And in 2013, it was Tzipi Livni and Yair Lapid, and then in the last three elections, we saw what happened when Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi, and unfortunately my colleagues at Labor, gave Netanyahu their mandate. So we really have to start from scratch, and it's unbelievable that we have, the people. And the truth of the matter is that the majority of Israelis are very moderate. They're not right wingers, even though it's very common to say that the people have gone to the right. That is not true. When you ask them about the issues, when you check their positions on the issues, not their political image or representation, then you see that most of Israelis really believe in, generally speaking, inequality, even civil equality for Arab citizens of Israel, and even a small majority that still supports the two-state solution. And they do not have the political representation that they can vote for. And this is a huge challenge that we are now facing. Actually, I think if you look at the situation, right now you guys in America are really, it looks like it's happy end. Okay, for now it's a happy end of this sort of chapter. But think of how the Democratic Party looked in the beginning of these primaries. It was not promising, not at all. It was fractured, it was fractioned, it was the fight within the Democratic Party was very threatening to what it can achieve. And in Israel, it's like this situation, but like much worse. So we really have our work cut out for us to start building now. And it takes patience and perseverance and faith. And it takes building back our confidence, because the number one thing that was shattered by the right, by Netanyahu, ever since 1993, when he started the campaign against Oslo and against Yitzhak Rabin, delegitimizing labor, Rabin, the left, bringing to Israeli public and political sphere new language and new images that we never had. When he started saying Netanyahu and the right are good for the Jews and the left is good for the Arabs, this is something that was never spoken in Israel. This kind of language was never used before. And now this narrative is so dominant in the public sphere that people call themselves right, not because their positions are anywhere close to the right, but because being called left is a curse, nothing short of a curse. And nobody wants to be that horrible, non-legit thing that is called left. So we have to really breathe very, very deeply, take a very, very deep breath, and really take into consideration that it'll take time to build, but that this is the only way to go about it in order to be able to come back with something that people can trust again. Because the main issue here is trust. We have to earn people's trust again.
But wasn't it the Intifada though that like crushed labor more than anything else? And that view of things? Tell me why that's
No.
wrong. Like, definitely my understanding.
Listen, Oslo was after the first Intifada. And
I mean the
still,
second.
it was. Yes, well, but the second came together with Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Labor, saying there is no partner. Once a prime minister from your camp is taking away your narrative and your belief and everything that you are so engaged in and you so believe in, and this is what, the number one thing that sort of was the rationale of the camp, you are left with nothing. And
Yeah, but
he was,
yeah,
it's as if he was reaffirming the other camp's narrative. He basically said they are right. So what are you left
yeah.
with? So it's not about the
But that,
Intifada itself. It's about what the leadership at the time did about it.
mhm. There's so
And
much to
Right.
say.
moreover,
Barry, how does it feel in the U.S. to you? I mean, on the issue of homelessness,
We could
political
do a
homelessness.
whole thing about this topic. Okay, homelessness.
Yeah.
It's just so interesting because the context, like Merav is on the left in Israel, but in a Jewish American context, she is so not on the left. And that is what's so fascinating. Our left is, um, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like, I see, I guess, the Biden and what Biden represents as being very different to where like the energy is in the Democratic Party right now. And the energy is with AOC and the squad and like that view of things. And if that is the future of the Democratic Party, I certainly don't see myself as being part of it. I don't, I don't embrace any number of the things that they do, and so that's my concern, right? Like, I think that a lot of the conversation going on right now between, like, let's just say the center left, progressives, is Biden the real face of the Democratic Party, a kind of moderate compromiser, or is the real face of the Democratic Party the upstarts? And I believe that if you just look at what happened with the Republican Party, beginning with the Tea Party movement, and I think ultimately culminating in the overtaking of the party by Trump, that I think we could be seeing something similar to that in the Democratic Party. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think that, like, to assume that, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, who are sort of on their way out the door, are going to continue to be the prevailing leadership or energy of the party just doesn't seem to me to be right, especially when you see the possibilities of how much can happen in a really short time. So um, I don't see I don't see, I'm not optimistic, let's say, that the parties are going to lead us out of polarization. Where I do see hope is in the cultural sphere, and not even in the legacy media. I see it in the kind of like pirate radio, podcasting space, Wild West newsletter universe, where all of the most, in my view, independent minded, interesting people are. And so I believe that politics is sort of downstream from culture, and that if we can change the culture and give, and I think it's the majority of Americans, the kind of silenced majority who believe in common sense, a cultural home, that ultimately that can have an effect on politics. But at least for the foreseeable future, I don't see a way out of the current polarization, unfortunately.
but can I ask you, Barry, are you, when you talked about AOC and the squad, and you said you do not subscribe to, do you not subscribe to any of their positions on issues, for instance, like the climate or economy, or is it? I mean, are those issues also their positions are too sort of extreme for you, or is it only
It,
the Israel or slash Jewish issues?
No, it's also, their version of the Green New Deal. Green New Deal sounds amazing, but I read their idea of what the Green New Deal is, and I'm absolutely not there. I don't think most Americans are. And it doesn't mean that I don't believe that climate change is real and that we shouldn't do things for climate change. Their view on capitalism, their view on, I mean, any number of issues. It's just not where I am. And it's not where I don't think, at least most Democratic voters are. I mean, if this election showed us anything, in a way, it was the repudiation of Trump, but it was also the repudiation of wokeism and the far left. That's what I think. That's one thing to read out of the kind of divided government that we got. A lot of the various initiatives in the states that passed. So yeah, I'm not woke. I mean, that's just not my outlook. So that's me.
But I will say, Merav, to your question, I do know Jewish Americans who are much more liberal than Barry, who would be with AOC and the squad on virtually everything, but Israel holds them back and leaves them wondering, where am I? And it even has left them, I mean, it didn't show up in the voting numbers, but has left them open to a Republican or, maybe not Trump, but some of the pro-Israeli stance that Republicans have tried to carve out for themselves. And so it is an interesting position for Jewish voters to be in. I want to ask you all, I want to bring it back a little bit more to the media. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, with your permission, that for me, when AOC canceled her participants in the memorial for Yitzhak Rabin, I was surprised. I mean, it's like, if you cannot participate in the memorial for Yitzhak Rabin, the person who was assassinated in Israel, for his conviction in the necessity for a peace process with the Palestinians, then what does it leave us with?
Yeah, and I would say that because I've been living inside of that world, I wasn't surprised at all, because it's any Israeli. It's any Israeli. Like, it's not like what's under assault at this point. And I talk to kids on college campuses every single day. 10 years ago, it was about criticizing the settlement movement, which I do readily. That was kind of the standard. If you did that, you could be accepted into the community of the good and the righteous. 5 years ago, it became, you need to disavow the fact that Israel came into being entirely, as being wrong, as being, creating, the victims, now becoming the victimizers. Need to disavow Israel. Now it's like basic pillars of Jewish identity. You need to disavow the idea of chosen people. You need to disavow, you can't go to Hillel because Hillel also has Israeli speakers and therefore is complicit in a genocide and systemic racism. That's really what it's about. When there's an anecdote, this young man who I correspond with a lot, who's incredible, told me, he was like, the Panera ran out of fresh baked cookies and it was referred to as the Zionist Panera. Zionist is now just a slur. And that's just become normative. And so if I sound radicalized or more strident than I would have a few years ago, it's because of that. I think it's because I've sort of been in the teeth of this ideology and I see where it can go. And I think that is why maybe, if we had this conversation a few years ago, I think that I would have been much more I would have been softer. And I think being close to it has kind of hardened me, because I see the logical conclusion of a lot of it. And the logical conclusion is, of course, you wouldn't do an event honoring Yitzhak Rabin if you buy into that view of the world.
Yeah, and I would say, I was going to ask you, Barry, if you were surprised, because I was not. I mean, the pressure, and it does start, really, the college campuses are the crucible for a lot of this. The pressure you can anticipate around all of this. Let me quickly just ask you guys about the media. And I can't help asking, Merav, you about your career change. And so quickly, could I ask you, which role have you felt gave you more power, writing or politics?
Well, first of all, you did not mention, but I did spend 25 years or so on television and radio. I started my career not in writing, but on the IDF radio station. And then I started two of the radio stations in Israel, and I was on television since I was 21 or so. And I had I had presented and produced my own primetime shows for really many years. And I was writing, and I was writing in between. And then after some time, when I was already out of television, because television and I went different ways, our paths have separated. And I became a writer for Haaretz. But the thing is that I was always very, very, very political from a very early age. My feminism goes back to, I don't know, the age of 4 or something. I don't remember myself as not having some kind of consciousness about the inequality as a girl, a woman. I don't know when I started using the word feminism. I don't have a recollection of some encounter with a word or with a term. It's sort of something that was very natural to me. I think only when I was in the Knesset already for a number of years, I realized that I actually come from two very political families. I mean, it skipped a generation. It totally skipped my parents, but both my grandfathers were deeply involved in political parties in Israel. My assassinated grandfather Kastner, who was assassinated for having been accused in Israel by an extreme right power for cooperating with the Nazis after he has saved at least, I mean, he's recognized in Yad Vashem for saving at least 20,000 Jews, where the research speaks of many, many, many more. So he was a member of Mapai, and he was in line to be a member of Knesset, and he was working for the government, and he was also a journalist. While my other grandfather was the last secretary of Mapam, the Socialist Party in Israel. It's soft socialism, and so I grew up where the talk about peace and equality was not considered politics to me, but just, the basis of life. This is what you work for. This is what you aspire for. This is what you try to do your best to achieve. And this is what I was always engaged in the youth movement, in school, in wherever I went. And I used to always have these kind of sayings on my shows. So I was known for having, first of all, for being opinionated, this animal that is a woman with an opinion. And somewhere in the mid 90s, where in Israel we skipped the feminist revolution that took place in the States in the 60s and the 70s because we were busy fighting other wars. In the 90s, when I looked in retrospect, I realized that it was the first decade that we did not have a major war going on. So in the in 95, I was approached when I was really in the peak of my primetime success. I was approached by two women from the rape crisis centers in Israel, which was at the time completely taboo. Nobody spoke about sexual assault in Israel. There was zero legitimization to come forward and speak about if you were hurt in any way, and there was zero government recognition. Obviously, we still did not have the term of sexual harassment. We did not have legislation against sexual harassment. And they came and asked me to host their annual fundraise. Now, I have seen their fundraise a year and a half prior to that, and I knew how lame, pathetic, and sleaze it was. And I said to them, I'll do anything you ask me to, but why would you do that? Why would you continue to play into the role of rape being something so marginal and dark and filthy and in like bad neighborhoods? You should take it to like the Lincoln Center of Tel Aviv and make it legit and bring the rich and the famous and start, really deriving change. And they were fascinated and they said, well, great idea, but how do you do this? I said, I don't know. Don't you have some committee, something? I knew nothing of charity at the time. And they said nobody was willing to be identified with the fight against rape. Even those who would help them would only do it incognito. It was so really something that was not considered even an option. And so I put together this group of prominent women. We started this huge campaign, actually the first ever public feminist campaign in Israel, and we made feminism and rape into something very, very mainstream. And since I was using all of my platforms to do that, I was approached soon by any other organization, and since I realized how effective I could be, and how much fun it was to bring money to organizations and to push legislation and to bring budgets and to bring other important or famous people to do the same. And so really I was doing that for 20 years out of my 30 years in the media. And so I was really already very much engaged in political work, even though it was not partisan. It was very clear what the sort of side of the map I'm in. And it was never clear to me that I would go to politics, even though I was asked in every interview, when will I go to politics and why am I not in politics? It was never obvious to me, because I thought, why does anyone want to be called this horrible word, a politician, where, you get to do stuff from where you are. And so when I somehow did became a politician and a member of Knesset, I have to tell you that I strongly believe that each and every one of us makes a change wherever we are, and it really has no importance, none whatsoever, if you are a political or a public figure or not. We make a difference or we don't make a difference. And when we don't make a difference, it's the same impact on reality, because when you refrain from doing something, you have an impact on reality, because you allow things to remain maybe the wrong way you think they are, but you're not doing anything about it. And when you're doing something about it, doesn't matter if you're doing it at home or at school or on the street or wherever. And it's a different kind of impact that you can make in the different arenas or platforms. But I don't believe that it's the place. It's not the position or the platforms that make you more effective or less effective. And I see that even in the Knesset, all of my 7.5 years in the Knesset, I've only been so far in the opposition. I still haven't been part of the government. And I have been much more effective than the majority of the members of Knesset in the coalition. Because it's not about the position, it's about what I want to achieve and how much I'm willing to work for this. So really, I tell that to people wherever I go. And I always tell women, especially, you can never tell anyone how far to go with the price that you have to pay in order to create change or to fight for what you believe in. But what you can tell them is to pay attention to the price that you're paying when you're not acting for the change that you want to achieve, and the gain there is when you are doing something about it. The gain is so huge and it's so satisfying and it's so worth it that when you do this kind of math, usually the outcome will be different.
I love that. So I have Barry. Are you going to run for office? This is now, Barry, it's your turn. Barry, you left journalism. Natural next step is a bigger platform for change, even if the platform doesn't matter.
I'm going to move upstate New York, open a bed and breakfast. No, I don't know what's next. But I'm just as Merav was, talking, and I'm like ready to vote for her for whatever she runs for, regardless of party. Is I just want to tie back to what we were saying about AOC and the squad before. I'm in awe of AOC. I might not agree with her on the vast majority of things she says, but she is the most charismatic, interesting, I hate using this word, but authentic politician, I think, maybe right now in the States. And there is so much to be learned from her example of just, just being her full self. Like I've never seen someone explode onto the scene the way she has, and I'm absolutely fascinated by her. I read everything she writes. I watch every makeup tutorial she does on Instagram. It's like she's doing a makeup tutorial and selling the Green New Deal to me. I mean, it's fascinating. As for what I'm doing next, I don't know. But as Merav was talking, I was thinking, and I read about your grandfather a few days ago. I had obviously heard of him, but as I was reading about you, I read about him. It's astonishing to me that there has not been a major feature film made about him. And I've been thinking about that with regard to so many Jewish stories. Like I think there should be a film called Avital about Avital Sharansky, like the housewife that brought down the Soviet Union. There should be a movie about Rudolf Kastner. I mean, it's an incredible story. We shouldn't just have Fauda and Stiesel. So that's one of 100 million things I'm thinking about. But, what's next for me is I don't see myself going back into legacy media. I'm just so much more interested in the kind of independent-minded, rebel, wrong think journalism that's happening outside of it. And that's the playground I want to be mucking around in. I don't know what exactly the form of it will take, but those are the most interesting conversations to me right now. And that's what I want to be a part of. And it's strangely, brought me into common conversation with people like Glenn Greenwald and The Intercept and the kind of like hard left socialists that, we align on we align against sort of the totalizing identity politics, and also with Megyn Kelly. And there's just a really interesting group of people right now that are in that space, and I'm super excited to sort of be a part of that.
That's wonderful.
Wow.
Well, yeah.
Yes, there's so much to look forward to. I just since you brought up since you brought up the film about Kastner, that first of all, by all means, please do write a film about Kastner. But let's begin with there's a documentary that was made, an American documentary. It's called Killing Kastner. It was made by the filmmaker Galen Ross. And it really captures the story amazingly well.
I saw it.
Now, since I get nothing out of it, so I'm just, it's important for me that people will see the film, because I think for me the number one lesson from my grandfather's story is the way how he found a way not to be a victim, even in the place where the role of the ultimate victim was written for him, like the Jew versus the Eichmann, the ultimate Nazi for that matter. And he found a way not to be a victim and to be an agent of action in favor of his community in this. And for me, it's something that I always kind of hold as a torch somewhere that you need to remember, even when you want to fall into despair or something that, by the way, our side of the political map in Israel, at least, is so addicted to the despair. People are so easy to just indulge in no hope, and it's in pessimism, and it's just unbelievable how people are enjoying this. So yes, by all means, a film about Rudolf Kastner is certainly due.
I just have a running list of all of the films that need to be made about Jewish stories. And I'm thinking about this a lot because my fiance Nellie is converting to Judaism, and she and I are like, she wants to watch everything, and we go to watch things, and it's like Holocaust, 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 which is important, but there are just so many other things and so many other Jewish stories that haven't been told. So I'm really interested in that as a bigger question.
Wow, we covered so much good stuff, and we could keep going for another 5 hours, but we'll leave it here for now. We'll do it again. Maybe next year we can do it in person. But this was a terrific panel. I cannot wait to see what the both of you do next. So thank you, and thank you again to Z3 and the JCC for hosting this terrific discussion.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you,
And
guys.
thank you, Bari. It's been a pleasure.
Total pleasure.